When you leave your heart in San Francisco and cut eastward across Northern California toward Lake Tahoe and Nevada, take note at mile 120 or so, right as Interstate 80 begins the climb into the Sierra, there is a pit stop and an off-ramp into a different century. Auburn, California, birthed by the gold rush, with a great feature, water and plenty of it, from the highest elevations of the Sierra snowpack, coming down the mountains into a series of icy cold canals that define the local geography. There's also another moving force crisscrossing the landscape in Auburn. You can hear it all the time as well. Active rail lines, testament to the railroad's taming of the wild, wild west. Public art features 22-foot-tall primitive concrete and rebar statues of gold miners and the Chinese indentured labor that built those railroads. In a town that generally loathes political correctness, the Cooley plaque draws nary a raised eyebrow. The vintage courthouse is a thing of beauty. Churches and churchgoers abound. Historical buildings dot every block of downtown. Real estate values are soaring, fueled by Bay Area refugees seeking a simpler life. Auburn and other towns within Placer County have rock-solid Republican allegiances, a red island in a very blue state. Of the 14,000 residents, 85% are white, 9% Hispanic, less than 1% black, and 5% either Asian, mixed race, or Native American. Most importantly for this little tale, Auburn is a place where everyone knows everyone, and few ever question law enforcement. So when 10 non-suicidal people over a short period of time turned up dead, either crushed by trains or drowned in the canals, nobody said much at all. It was all too easy not to be too curious about people without a lot of social status. Was Auburn the proverbial town without pity? Or more likely, did folks just not realize the degree to which each of these dead people was someone's somebody? For 3-year-old Evangeline and Mommy Brittany, Daddy Calvin never came home one night.
Color, Eva. Tell them your favorite color.
Blue.
This mother, Judy, and father Ronnie's only son, Ronny Jr., was found decapitated by a train. 2 young children lost a mother they adored and who adored them, Danna Bass. An inconsolable sister, Carrie, knows her college grad iconoclastic brother Matt, an avid swimmer, never would have willingly gone into a canal wearing 3 pairs of pants. This man, Brian, drove from another state several times to ask basic questions he said the police never did about how and why his disabled brother, David, drowned. The cops quickly, sometimes within hours, dubbed all the canal and train track deaths as either accidental or suicides. They did little, if any, investigation, but often claimed the contrary. The editor of the Auburn Journal at that time, Derek Rothy, remembers publishing a column which questioned why there were so many such deaths in relatively quick succession. He caught the ire of the Auburn Police Department.
At the newspaper, we thought there might be a serial killer out there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
That's what we said. I'm sure we wrote editorials to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So, and the opinion that we got from law enforcement is, you know, this might be a neat way to sell newspapers, to get everybody talking about the journal, but it's just not factual. You know, these are homeless people, they get drunk, they camp along the canal, they fall in, you know. No matter how drunk you are, after a couple of other people have died, do you kind of stay away from those? I would think you would, right?
And did you ever get a sense that they were investigating these things fully or at all, or they had just decided it was...
I think they were investigating them to a certain extent, but they did not agree that there was a serial killer out there. A great number of people here, I can say that the people that I know thought it was suspicious from day one and outrageous that they would jump to a conclusion so quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess in my opinion, it's easier to think it was an accident than to have to go and do a bunch of work investigating.
Ending that notion is Dr. Gordon Ainsley, former Auburn Parks and Recreation Chief, local legend and founder of the internationally known Western States Endurance Run. When you first saw those stories, what went through your mind? When you first heard that people were drowning in the canals?
Well, the first one, I didn't think anything of it.
Yeah.
And the second one, I really didn't think anything of it. And then when the third one came along, I thought, there's something going on. And then there was the fourth. Wasn't any factual basis that would justify none in 5 years and then suddenly 5 in a year and a quarter.
Ainsley, who has extensive direct knowledge in and out of the canals, as well as in assisting law enforcement as a public official, called the police chief at the time, Valerie Harris. He wanted to help nail the perp.
I offered my services. I said,
you did?
I will walk that canal, pretend I'm drunk, I'll dress like a homeless person, I'll probably wear some kind of a skull cap to protect my head, and from a blow, and I want a Mae West on a CO2 cartridge that I can go
Right.
and I want to be wired for sound.
Did you get the feeling that they didn't have the resources, or they just didn't want to investigate?
They didn't want it.
And why do you think
Well,
that?
she said there's nothing here to indicate that these aren't accidental deaths. I said, what are you talking about? There's at that point there were 5 in a year and a quarter, and there were none in the previous 5 years. I said, that's enough. She said, no, it isn't. What I got is kind of like it's bad for business to be saying we've got this murder on the loose. It makes our town not look safe and warm and fuzzy
and idyllic, as we like.
Yeah, and they didn't want to. They didn't want if there was a way not to call it a murder, they were going to call it an accident. I think they were thinking like a Chamber of Commerce.
And that would have been it. But for 2 veteran private investigators and a longtime reporter and lawyer who also wanted to know more. Investigator Larry DeMates recalls how the first canal case drew his attention.
Well, for me, I happen to know David Miller from my previous job, and he meant to be an intelligent guy. The newspaper purported him to be homeless, which was absolutely not true. He owned his own mobile home park nearby. He had a brand new pickup truck. It also mentioned that he had consumed alcohol and this and that. At the time that I knew David Miller, he did not drink. He drank maybe a beer. But what caught my eye initially was the fact that the Sheriff's Department spokesman had put out to the press that this was a homeless guy who was intoxicated and fell in the canal.
Ask no questions.
Yeah.
P.I. Jim Goodrich, a storied former Navy SEAL and reserve police officer, was intrigued by what he said had not happened in both the canal and train cases.
First responders, you get to an accident, you get to a crime scene, there's preliminary investigation. You secure the area, look for witnesses, interview a few people, take some photos, etc. In all these cases, be it the canal or the railroads, we find that has not happened.
And the third member of this trio, me, your humble narrator, Christine Kraft. I covered rape, murder, mayhem, and politics for several decades as a television reporter and anchor.
It's the third day of the 1984 Democratic National Convention, and the delegates are still buoyed up by the oratorical inspiration of Mario Cuomo's keynote address.
I challenged sex discrimination in the TV news industry as a federal litigant before becoming a lawyer. I knew directly of Larry DeMate's excellent work in a prior murder case, and I was keenly interested in what he and Jim had to say about the 10 deaths. People who may not have high social class, maybe homeless or low social class, but their lives mattered, and what happened to them matters a lot. It's not about race, it's more about economic status and the degree to which law enforcement does or doesn't do its job. First, you start with the timeline of all the deaths in the canal. David Miller, January 14th, 2009, age 53. Bradford Ashcraft, July 29, 2009, age 62. Larry James, February 28, 2010, age 58. Nicasio Garcia-Bonilla, March 26, 2010, age 42. Matthew Templeman, May 5, 2010, age 40. Richard Hill, November 23, 2010, the last canal death, age 50. Hit by trains and not surviving or surviving briefly, Lowell Grenon, May 27, 2010, age 30. Danna Bass, July 4, 2014, age 36. Ronny Daniel Jr., August 6, 2014, age 34. Calvin Kelley, hit October 25, 2015, comatose for a few weeks before taking off life support, age 21. What's so unusual about a bearded homeless guy on drugs or alcohol ending up dead in the canal? That was pretty much the law enforcement line to the media when bodies started turning up in the canals. But just because victim 1, David Miller, had a scraggly beard, didn't mean he fit that instant stereotype. David Miller had lived most of his life in the area, gone to high school at Placer High, worked at his dad's home contracting business for years, until a horrific motor vehicle accident in the 80s left him with serious permanent impairments. He was far from homeless. He had a new truck, a well-equipped live-in fifth wheel, and a spot at the Auburn Hill Mobile Estates. His brother, Brian.
My father had just passed away and left us a little bit of money. And David had his own money. He was able to save money even on disability, so he lived very inexpensively.
Right.
But yeah, he had, I would estimate probably $20,000 to $30,000 worth of extra money that he had stashed, you know.
Do you know if he kept it in the bank, or he was someone who was so private and personal that he sort of kept it himself hidden someplace?
He didn't trust banks, so yeah, he kept it hidden on his own, either in his house or his truck.
Brian drove from his Idaho home when he got word about his disabled brother being found floating face down in the canal. He trekked upstream to the likely spot where David first entered the water, about 800 feet from the trailer park. On his own, Brian found witnesses to his brother's last hours alive near a retaining wall in a shopping center.
Construction workers told me he came to this wall and was going to jump off of it.
Yikes.
Because somebody was chasing him. That's what he told the construction workers. They coaxed him into going down to the far end of the wall to get down because it's only 2 or 3 feet tall.
As opposed to,
As opposed to
10 something plus.
Probably 10 feet. And
But he was obviously scared of something, or he wouldn't have been trying to
jump off a 10-foot wall.
I mean, you know your brother. Did he have fantasies of being chased or mental illness that would
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Yeah.
The workers helped David down from the wall. He told them he was being chased by somebody. He took off into the brush. Brian told the sheriffs what he had discovered.
They came out, sent one officer to take a report from the construction workers. The officer, when he was done with that, told me he would go file a report, and that was the last thing I heard.
David's girlfriend at the time, Candy Caraway, recounts how they met when she was working at a deli. They fell in love, and she moved in with him. She remembers little details, like where he kept his keys.
The keys were always on him, or unless they're right there by the door.
Mm-hmm.
A little hook.
Mm-hmm. And where did he keep the keys?
Up there by the door.
I mean, if he had them with him, did he carry them in his pocket?
He
or
carried them on his little hoop thing,
on his belt?
little belt thing.
David and Candy broke up just before he died, and Candy had gone up the hill an hour and a half to the casino in Reno with a friend named John, a man David disliked. Candy says John was too curious about where David kept his money and then left suddenly and angrily, stranding her in Reno. I asked her a hypothetical question.
Do you think if, just supposing, Dave and John had had an encounter, face to face, and John's trying to take the money or get the keys from David or whatever, would David have fought? Would he have fought back?
Yeah. Of course he
And he
would.
was disabled, so he wouldn't have been very able to fight back very well.
No.
Was John bigger than David?
Yeah.
And he wasn't, was he disabled, John?
No.
No. So he would have been the stronger of the two.
Yeah. Yeah. Dave had bad knees. And,
So John could have, just hypothetically here, because we don't know for sure what happened, but John could have attacked David and David would have fought back, but David probably wouldn't have been able to defend himself all that well. Kind of like a sitting duck.
Larry DeMates asks Caraway if the cops ever questioned her.
Did you ever use David's address as your address to receive mail or anything like that? The fifth wheeler, the trailer? Did you
Probably.
get mail? Did you get mail there?
Probably
So
I
people
did.
knew you lived there with David.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't a secret. I mean,
No.
people knew you and David lived together.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And did the police ever contact you to see if you might know anything
No.
about David?
Investigators DeMates and Goodrich note that David Miller's cane, one shoe, and shirt were not with his body. The PIs theorize an attack could have gone down like this.
I'm David Miller.
Yes, hi
Okay,
David.
so, and I'm kind of,
They're wrestling like this, and they want to get his keys because he didn't want them to take their truck, which they have used his truck before. So he gets them with a wrestling like that, and then Miller's backing away, and the shirt comes off.
then on the ground, Miller starts kicking.
And then they kick, and while they're doing that, I think he was on the ground, and they're pulling, and one shoe came off, and then they throw him in the drink.
The autopsy report showed no alcohol intoxication, just appropriate levels of pain meds legally prescribed for his disabilities, and some pot. He had a deep, blunt force head wound not compatible with drowning. And there was one more thing.
Besides all that about the injuries, the gray-brown soil noted in the autopsy report under David's fingernails, and the pathologist mentioning that he had the same soil embedded in the palms of his hands. In the autopsy report, it's attributed to David being working with his hands as a manual laborer. Well, per our interviews and also my personal knowledge, David hadn't worked in 20 or 25 years. There was no reason for him to have that. But what happens is if you do make this motion, Jim and I have talked about it, that's more consistent with dragging, which is like this. And it is our contention that that didn't come from falling in the water. That came from a confrontation or a struggle prior to David going in the water.
When his body was recovered, his keys were still attached to the belt loop of his jeans, the money still inside the truck. Bradford Ashcraft, the second canal victim, was homeless. His body was found dressed in a green long-sleeve top and jeans, a fact not reported to the public. A confidential informant, or CI, gave detailed information to private investigators DeMates and Goodrich. The CI said it was late at night when the CI was walking down Bell Road carrying night vision binoculars just purchased at the Goodwill store. This informant was not homeless but knew several such folks. There were some mental health and alcohol issues, so we wanted to determine directly for ourselves if it was even possible to see what the CI claimed to have seen that fatal night. Our confidential informant told us he was walking down Bell Road at night, stopped in these bushes to relieve himself. He says he then looked across Bell Road and saw what he thought were 3 law enforcement types roughing up a man, and then he heard a splash of a body into the canal.
There you are. Where have you been?
I've been around here.
Where have you been? Where have you been?
Around here. I
I thought we told you to leave.
I heard you the first time. What are you doing?
Wait. Okay.
Hold on. Okay.
Well, those cuffs aren't too tight, are they? Huh?
Yes, they're too tight.
I'm going to tell you what. We're going to tell you to leave. One more time. And
I told you I'd leave.
I'll leave.
Let me go.
All right, you understand?
We found the line of sight exactly as described, the sound easy to hear. The informant described how you could see specific sheriff's deputies with the night vision binoculars and noted that the man they were hassling was wearing a green long-sleeve top and jeans. Since we had no way to know if the informant's identifications were accurate, we aren't using the names given us. Similarly, the Auburn Journal printed a picture of this graffiti, which occurred shortly thereafter, with the name of a specific deputy also omitted. Interestingly, the autopsy referred to the green, long-sleeved top and jeans. There were defensive wounds on the knuckles and a perfect circular bruising completely around the victim's left wrist, the sort you would acquire from too tight handcuffs. The sheriff's department said he was drunk and had died of a heart attack. The informant also described seeing unmarked police cars with backseat passenger grills speeding away from the scene. The Placer County Sheriff's Department declined numerous requests for comment. Canal deaths number 3 and 4 had some commonalities. Neither Larry James nor Nicasio Garcia-Bonilla were homeless. Both had full-time jobs, and they were seen together the night they presumably both died. Larry James was a computer repair technician at a retail outlet. He had a home. Nicasio Garcia-Bonilla was one of the best custom pool finishers around, an artist with gunite, rock, and tile. The high-end pool company he worked for described him as an expert and someone who was well-liked and always on time and reliable at work. He had a nice apartment. At the time they both died, James being discovered in the canal the day after he entered it, and Bonilla more than 3 weeks later, local law enforcement kept insisting to the media that all the canal deaths were just drunk homeless people. It wasn't true. James and Garcia-Bonilla were last seen by witnesses at a popular bar and restaurant, Chevy's. They were spotted as well in the parking lot behind Chevy's. Both of them liked to drink, and their corpses had alcohol on board, more than the legal limit for driving. Neither was observed driving in that condition. When their bodies were removed from the canal, James had numerous abrasions and multiple broken ribs, a condition not compatible with drowning or even scraping along a canal wall. Those wounds would be significantly less severe, says former Navy SEAL PI Goodrich. Garcia-Bonilla was found in a state of advanced decomposition in the Wise Forebay. It was determined that both had died around the same time, March 1st, 2010. The question remains unanswered. Would two drinking buddies, both with good jobs and homes, likely have decided to just jump into the canal and kill themselves? Or was a killer involved? What would cause a relatively young man with a degree in chemistry, a fluency in multiple languages, a property owner with rental income, and close family ties in the Pacific Northwest to choose to live in a tent in a homeless encampment hidden in the brush along the Auburn Canal? Matt Templeman's sister, Carrie, says he was an iconoclast, perhaps too generous and trusting, a man who eventually preferred the company of nature and animals, particularly dogs, to the expectations of a more structured society.
Well, he did live in a tent. He had rented several places, lived with a lot of people, but, back to those mistakes that he made, he loved animals. And so he would go to a friend's house and he would take his dog and the dog would be all over the furniture, and he never understood why people didn't like that. And so they would ask him to leave.
And he would do it over and over again.
He was dumbfounded every time. Yeah. He was hurt. So I just think he did better outside. He camped and hiked.
With no controls, without anybody else telling him, you must keep the house this way, or...
Yeah, he just never could fit into the society, as brilliant as he was.
Matt also got thrown in the clink more than once for alcohol-related offenses and loitering. Carrie sent Matt money and got him a cell phone. They talked frequently and regularly. On their last phone conversation shortly before he died, what he told her left her shaken.
He was very upset, and he said, Carrie, the police threatened me today. And I said, what did they say, Matt? And he said, you better leave town or else. And I didn't know what to say. I asked him if he wanted help, if he wanted to get out of town. And he said, I don't know. I better think about it. And he was very frazzled, and my brother was not overdramatic.
So it would be very uncommon for him to call with that degree of emotion.
Extremely uncommon.
And you could hear the fear in his voice.
Absolutely.
You had no doubts that he was being genuine about that.
I have no doubt about it at all. Sad, sad.
Soon after that, Matt's family in Oregon got a knock on the door from a family friend who was a cop. He told them Placer County had retrieved Matt's body in the canal. He had been in the water for some time, making a calibration of alcohol levels incalculable. Carrie made trips and phone calls, was at first given the wrong autopsy report, and Matt's still wet cell phone in a biohazard bag. I asked her about what law enforcement had done to investigate her brother's death.
The way that they conduct an investigation is a direct message. That his life
in and of itself, yes.
That his life didn't matter, his death didn't matter.
Carrie says her brother was never suicidal, and the details of how Matt's corpse was found clad in 3 pairs of pants made no sense.
My brother swam all the time. He would swim under the tunnels and the rivers that nobody else would. He would jump in one town into a river that's known to take lives in Oregon. And he'd jump in one town and float down to a few towns later and get out and get a ride back, and he swam all the time.
So he was a good swimmer.
He was an excellent swimmer. He took lifeguard classes when he was a kid, and I mean, he was a good swimmer. The chances of him drowning are not likely.
Dan James, who has walked his dog for years along the canal, which is near his family home, met Matt Templeman on a walk.
My dog lady and I used to walk down there for years. And I met him one time and he invited me over to his camp. He was very nice. We had a conversation. And then the next time I came back, he was there. We go over to his camp, and he gave us chili. So then I got to where my mother, when she cooked, I would bring him down food. So he was a very nice guy,
and pretty well educated, I understand.
Oh yes, he was smart. That's what I got out of it.
He says he never saw sheriff's deputies hassling the homeless, but he did see a strange man in the camp a week before Matt disappeared. He tried to tell the sheriff's department.
I called the sheriff's department several times. Nobody ever got back to me.
And you just wanted them to know that you knew him and you found it really strange that he suddenly disappeared.
I had information that they might be interested in.
Private investigators Goodrich and DeMates described some unusual wounds on Templeman's body, noted in the correct autopsy report.
Page 3, line 114. Among a lot of his injuries, they found round circles under the hairline resembling gunshot wounds. That came from the autopsy report. Those gunshot wounds appears to be indentations from the muzzle of a handgun that was found on the side of his head, the temple area, and behind his head. I personally took a measurement of my 9mm, and it was very close. Those measurements that I found were very close to the ones that were in the autopsy. Again, consistent with that indentation of a muzzle of a handgun.
On the coroner's report, here again, Detective Pecoraro advised the coroner office that the Auburn Police Department would be investigating this case as a suspicious death. And to the best of our knowledge, it never occurred.
After this 5th death in the canal, PG&E erected chain link fences, more warning signs, and 4 rope buoys to grab onto. DeMates notes his disappointment at a religious-based homeless health care clinic, workers there who knew things that they were reluctant to talk about.
One of the most frustrating things during our investigation was that there were literally dozens of people who would not be on camera, but yet they would share a lot of pertinent information regarding the canal and the tracks.
One woman who agreed and then backed out at the last minute of an on-camera interview in particular.
Who gave us great information about the interactions of the Placer County Sheriff's Department and the homeless, but she was afraid to come on camera.
The last suspicious canal drowning we examined occurred after PG&E put up fencing. Richard Hill fit the law enforcement stereotype of homeless and stoned on booze and drugs in and out of jail, but did he accidentally fall in? His mother pointed out he would have had to get over the fence, and neighbors at the canal adjacent trailer park heard a nasty fight in the wee hours. Some even heard a splash. One neighbor, Janet Park, had a surprise visitor at the back of her trailer home.
I heard noises talking out, those voices, and...
Where were they coming from? Could you tell?
From the back of the house.
From the back of your place?
From the back, yeah. And
2 men, 2 women?
2 men. And the next thing I knew, someone's pounding on my door, which scared me to death, my back door, because I hadn't heard the gate open. So I knew no one had come through the gate. And when I looked through the blinds out my dining room window, this guy's standing there. And he looked,
did you know him?
No, he looked like Charles Manson. I mean, he had the hair everywhere and the beard and you know, nasty, dirty. He was just scary.
Mm-hmm.
And
did he say he wanted to come in?
No, he kept saying, I want a rope, I want a cord. I said, I don't have a rope.
She called 911 and an officer did come out.
You did call 911?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yes. Did anybody come out, any law enforcement?
A police officer came, never said a word to me. He looked in my gate and started to the back, and I said, there is no one back there. The guy's gone. And they left, and I never seen anybody else.
So the police officer didn't ask you, did he give you his card?
He didn't give me anything.
Didn't talk to you at all?
Not at all.
The following day, Janet and her neighbors saw the Charles Manson look-alike again, and again called the sheriff, who responded.
Well, we'll try to pick him up. I mean, he just wasn't concerned at all about it.
Not in the least. Didn't ask you any more questions about what had happened?
Did not ask me anything else. Like, he didn't care, he already knew everything he needed to know.
Didn't ask you what time this had happened? No questions at all?
Nothing whatsoever to do with the night before.
Neighbor Michael Douglas believes that the victim had been at the trailer park earlier in the day of his death, asking him for help, but not saying why. Douglas also saw the other fellow, Manson Man, the next day, seemingly searching for something on the ground. I asked Douglas if cops had ever questioned him.
So no cops ever knocked on your door and asked if you'd seen anything or heard anything?
Douglas says the sheriff did talk to the scruffy fellow, but not to any of the trailer park residents who had witnessed sounds and details of the fatal night before, including the one who heard a splash. Most interestingly, the Auburn Journal reported that the only way they even knew of the death was from a hotline tip. The sheriff's spokesman said he was unaware of it. After the 6th canal death, a woman whose relatives told her not to say anything for fear of retribution came forward to the Auburn Journal and KCRA TV News. Betty Starr's son, Kenny Minero, had told her in 2008 that he'd been walking along the canal at night and was deliberately and forcefully pushed in by an unseen assailant. Minero grabbed onto branches and managed to scramble out, seriously scraping his foot to the bone. Mom tended to the wound at the time. Kenny died of other causes in 2009, and Betty felt compelled then to alert authorities and talk to the media. She said law enforcement was not interested in her information. With some exception, once the PG&E fences were in place and canals much less accessible, suspicious deaths began increasing nearby, on the train tracks, an even better place to cover up a murder. The first of these was this young man, Lowell Grenon, shown here with his constant companion, his beloved Bosco. They were to become train conductor Theodore King's worst nightmare. Born into a loving Mormon family, Lowell Grenon was one of 9 kids who had a blast playing, who were loved by their parents and a large extended family. Lowell was known as a cheerful kid who always took care of the littlest kids, babies and dogs. He grew up in Northern California and had spent the last dozen years of his life near his family in Auburn. He joined the California Conservation Corps as a young man and thrived in the great outdoors, surrounded by natural beauty and doing lots of hard work building the state's parks and trails. Everybody loved him. He wasn't someone who would pick fights, but he would stand up for his friends or young women who were harassed. The CCC didn't care that Lowell had a learning disability when it came to regular classroom instruction, or that he had a profound speech impediment. He was just a top-notch, hardworking, strong, sweet, genuine person. The world outside of the CCC was less kind at times. Lowell struggled to find work and places to live. He was able to get jobs as a house painter and handyman, but often his speech issues made applying for jobs or apartments more difficult than they should have been. When he didn't have a place to stay, he'd camp out. He was kind to the homeless folks he met, often giving away possessions like his shoes to someone more needy than him. Right before his 30th birthday, his mom Joanne and beloved Aunt Jean made him a birthday dinner. Lowell liked beer and had been drinking that night. He was upbeat, not suicidal, was excited to have found a new place to live, and was looking forward to moving in. Like many people, especially the younger ones in Auburn, Lowell often walked along the tracks to get from one neighborhood to another. In the wee hours of this particular morning, something went horribly wrong. The video made by the onboard camera was viewed and described by an investigator from the Placer County Coroner's Office, S. Frick.
The video segment begins with the train traversing a slight curve to the right in the tracks. The forward-facing lights of the locomotive are clearly illuminating the tracks. The engineer is sounding the locomotive's horn repeatedly. The train was traveling slowly, perhaps 20 miles per hour, if that. An object that was not distinguishable came into view. It could only be described as a large pile or lump laying motionless, partially across the tracks from right to left. The object, later determined to be the decedent, was not recognizable as that of a person, was stationary. No movement was detected during the approach of the locomotive, still sounding its horn. No movement was noted until the decedent was no longer in view as the train passed over him. I could see a small, lighter object immediately beyond and next to the decedent. Repeated viewings revealed this was the head of the decedent's dog peering over the decedent. It too was motionless, staring ahead into the locomotive's lights. I could not determine if the decedent was injured, asleep, or unconscious prior to impact. I saw nothing in the video that led me to believe that this was a suicide.
Lowell's legs were severed at the ankles. He sustained numerous blunt trauma wounds to the head and skull, and a score of other abrasions and gashes on his body. He had had too much alcohol in his system to have driven, but Lowell didn't drive. Mom Joanne had the assumption that law enforcement would at least have an investigation, but she never heard anything from them. Some of the younger homeless people who knew Lowell apologized for having mocked his speech impediment. Many folks told Joanne to just accept it as suicide, despite her continuing intuitive doubts. Was Bosco the dog witness to his master getting beat up and placed on the tracks? And yes, dogs who have a complete bond with their people will stay with them, even in such perilous and terrifying circumstances. Did Lowell, who had no history of blackouts, just drink too much and pass out in the middle of the tracks? No special forensics were performed. None of it made much sense, then or now. Danna Bass once had a great job as the top accountant for a nationally distributed natural foods line. A serious relationship produced 2 kids, a boy and a girl. But when financial troubles led to a breakup, the ensuing custody battle left Danna prone to bad choices in men. She was determined to turn things around for herself and her children, resurrecting her career when she was found dead on the tracks. She had many friends who told of Danna having an argument with a man the night she died. One, who didn't want to be identified, said the cops never talked to her or others who had seen Danna that night. They were all positive that Danna wasn't suicidal. The autopsy report dwells for a considerable time on an analysis of Danna's reproductive history, but nary a word on whether or not she had been sexually assaulted. There is an intriguing note about undetermined soils and leafy material found under her fingernails and on her body, but there was no further analysis of either. Blood samples showed alcohol, the metabolites of asthma medicines, and non-prescription stimulants, and a single raised mark on one arm, possibly a needle track. There was massive trauma to her head. Her friends openly posted their shock, dismay, remembrances, along with their names on the journal's website. Law enforcement didn't contact any of them. Her children went to live with their paternal grandparents. Ronny Daniel Jr. had a job and a home. He was out bowling with buddies one summer night and had picked up some items at the store, carried in his backpack, including food for his cat, Monsoon. He frequently walked alongside the tracks, the shortest route from downtown Auburn to his house. He was lying with his head on the rail when the train decapitated him. His mother, Judy, was awakened by a knock on her door.
Sheriff arrived at my front door.
What time of
About
day?
7:30 in the morning. And he'd requested to talk to me, and I was a little shocked. It's like, what would the sheriff be here for? And then I got up and asked him what he needed, and I was at the top of the stairs, so I was just talking to him from there. And he told me there'd been an accident with my son, Ronny. And I asked him if he was okay, and he told me no, he was deceased. It took me a couple seconds to collect my thoughts, and I was sobbing uncontrollably, and I asked him what happened, and he told me that it was an apparent suicide. Shouldn't make any sense, but at the time I was trying to process it all. So.
Of course. And when you heard suicide, this was just how many hours after the supposed suicide did they determine it was a suicide? I mean, how long had this happened before they decided it was a suicide? Until they reached you?
Well, they said that this whole situation happened at 10:30 at night.
The night before?
The night before. And then they were telling me this at 7:30 in the morning. So what, 9 hours?
And did you say, how do you know it was a suicide?
No, I think my reaction was, oh my God. I didn't know what else to say. And then after that, then the officer asked, and I asked him some other, I didn't, just vague questions, and he said he didn't have any other information. And then he left. So that's, I was just standing, I couldn't believe any of it. It was just crazy.
And of course, all of us fear that moment when a sheriff or someone comes to the door and asks to speak to you because is it going to be the death of a loved one, etc. When you heard suicide, in your experience with your son, had there ever been anything about him that suggested to you he would take his own life?
Absolutely not. Ronny was, he was a great kid. He kind of liked himself a lot. He was a handsome boy, and he always had to tell you how good looking he was. And so no, he liked himself too much.
Judy and her former husband, Ronny Sr., went to the funeral home, where they were told they could only view their son's hands and lower forearms. They clearly saw huge, glaring bruises on both sets of knuckles, but no other injuries on those hands and lower arms.
I knew it. I said, no, those are fighting wounds. He was fighting with somebody. They're only his knuckles, and it's not anywhere else.
Did you go to law enforcement and tell them what you
Absolutely, we did. We were immediately, we called and demanded to see them. And they sent an officer out, and he sat there. He was a little, he seemed like he was just like we were wasting his time, because he didn't really seem like he wanted to talk to us. And it's like, so we asked him, what more do you have? Where did you come to this conclusion that this is what's happened to him?
How did they conclude that it was suicide?
Right, exactly.
How they reached that?
How did you reach that conclusion?
And did you assume at this point that they had done some sort of investigation at the scene or talked to people that he knew? And did you assume they?
Well, I would have assumed that, because basically, you think about it. How did they come up with suicide? They had to have looked at something to have actually determined that. And so, I asked him, I said, well, I want to know how you come up with that, because I already know that's not something Ronny would do. And then that's when he tells me, well, you know your son had a record.
I'm laughing because that has no relevance to anything. And
I was so stunned. I just told him, I said, what does that have to do with it?
And he had been in some fights and got into a little bit of trouble,
Yes,
but
he did.
nothing big, no felonies, nothing like that.
No.
So, so your sense was that this sheriff's deputy, I'm guessing, right, was telling you that because your son had a misdemeanor record for getting in some fights, and somehow he killed himself or deserved to die. Did you just feel like you were getting the brush off?
That's exactly the way I felt. I asked him that. I said, because he has a record, does that mean he deserved to die? And he's like, well, no parent likes to admit that their child has committed suicide. And it's like, oh, this guy was starting to get under my skin at this point.
He wasn't really answering your question.
No, he wasn't. He was tap dancing. And then I asked him about the hands. And I said, I want you to go out there and I want you to look at Ronnie's hands. I said, those are defensive wounds. And he says, well, maybe they're offensive wounds. I'm like, what difference does it make?
Whatever it is, those wounds would indicate that he ended up on those tracks not because of any suicidal act, but that there's somebody else involved.
There was something involved. And I asked him to go look at his hands. I said, I want you to go over there and I want you to look. And he says, well, we have pictures, so I'm not going to do that. And I mean, at this point, I already knew we weren't going anywhere with this guy. They'd already made their determination, and they were not going to go any farther with it.
The only thing he said to you was, your son had a misdemeanor record or had a record for some fights, and no parent wants to admit that their child committed suicide. And basically, that was how they determined it was suicide. There's no explanation of how they made their determination.
Not one thing did they tell me that actually came to that conclusion. I think that was all on them. They made that determination themselves, and they weren't going to listen to anything else.
Ronnie's friends who had gone bowling with him that night said he was upbeat, fun, drinking beer, and had some poison oak on the top of his hands, but no bruises.
If he noticed that, he would have noticed those bruises. Those bruises were very significant.
And he saw them before, so...
Right, and he said that there was no bruises on his hand, definitely.
Judy describes the backpack and its contents.
The backpack he had went shopping and he bought some cat food for his cat. He had a roll of paper towels and he had a half a beer. There was a girl at der Waiter Schnitzel. He stopped there and got him some cheese fries. And she had seen him there, and we found a receipt in his pocket too. There was a receipt, that's right. There was a receipt in his pocket that told us exactly what time he was there. He was at 8:17.
So 8:17, he's getting some food, some cheese fries, and who doesn't love those?
Yes,
at der Waiter Schnitzel.
Absolutely.
And what time did the sheriff's department tell you the train hit him?
They said 10:30.
Just a 7-minute walk up the tracks from where Ronnie's body was discovered is the Auburn der Wiener Schnitzel. Deborah Peak remembers serving Ronnie some chili cheese fries that night, about 2.5 hours before he was hit by the train. She says he'd been drinking and was clearly upset about something.
I think he was so agitated that he ran across somebody and got into a confrontation with him and lost. Truthfully. I think that's what happened. I don't know who, why, or what.
You don't think he just walked down the tracks and lay down and was
No.
And you would say perhaps because maybe his ego was too strong for that?
Yeah, because he was very agitated and he wasn't backing down. So it's...
Sort of thought maybe he was in a fight with somebody or was having some
It's what it seemed like. It seemed like he had just come from arguing and was fighting with somebody. It was still going on in his head. So it was...
Did you, the next day or the couple days after, did the police come and interview and talk to you?
His dad came and talked to us, Melissa, and private investigators, and that's it. No police ever came.
Ever? Yep. So private investigators talked to you. Ronnie's dad came, but never any cops or detectives or anything. Did that surprise you?
No, because I knew the cops were calling it a suicide, even though it wasn't. I knew that's what they were doing. So to them, it was just an open and shut case.
Ronnie's dad, Ronnie Sr., an expert tracker and hunter, found the precise spot where paramedics first responded.
So here I am. I'm walking down the tracks. There's a glove, another glove, another glove.
Must be the spot.
Yeah. They didn't clean nothing up.
I found
And it wasn't
parts of my son. They didn't clean it up like they should have.
He says he and his son had big plans for an upcoming trip, and Ronny Jr. had scheduled a few days off from his restaurant job.
If he was going to commit suicide, he would have jumped up and attacked the train. You know, like, come on. He wouldn't have just laid there. And who lays there? That's when the deputy told me that he was laying there with his hat over his face, and the engineer said that he never even flinched or moved. I'm like, dude, you can lay there and do that. There's no way.
Calvin Kelley, our final victim, barely out of his teens, lived like this, in a coma for weeks before dying. Likely beaten up and left on the tracks for the train to finish him off, Calvin was not some stereotypical drunk homeless guy that the locals frequently deride. He was a musician, a drummer in a popular band, a father of a little girl, a boyfriend, a worker with multiple jobs, a son. He loved hanging out with his buddies. This video from a burrito eating contest a couple of months before his death. This is Calvin, a few hours before his ultimately fatal encounters, checking out the performance of a rap band at the local club Pistol Pete's. His best friend and bandmate, Justin Haskin, had spent several hours with Calvin earlier that day.
Well, we went to Sierra Bar and Grill to have a drink or two, and we just walked. And when we walked back, we've been hanging out for like 4 or 5 hours already throughout the day. And he wanted to go to a rap concert, and I'm not really into rap. We both made like heavy rock music, so I wasn't really into it.
Calvin left Pistol Pete's at some point to walk home along the nearby tracks, a direct route to the family house as he had done thousands of times before. His father, Mike, his mother, Tony, describe what came next.
We got a call at 6 in the morning from the hospital, the nurse at Sutter Roosevelt.
So nothing from the Auburn Police Department?
No.
Your first contact is with the hospital
Yeah,
after
the
he's already
nurse
in hospital.
at the hospital calls me and says that he's in surgery, that they had pulled him out from under a train in Auburn. And, 6 in the morning waking up, we're confused. Wife's freaking out. So we jump in the car, we run down there.
We came in and we walked around the corner, and the oldest daughter, Ellen, hit the floor. She fainted. And I was surprised because I thought, my gosh, he got hit by a train and his face isn't messed up. His chest, his legs were broken, his arms, and his head.
But it still looked like him, in other words.
Oh yeah, no, I figured his face would be gone and all of that, but he was just hurt so bad it was shocking to see.
Called his friend Justin. I called his daughter's mother, Brittany. Told everybody what happened.
We had like some, family over or whatever, and I got a phone call while I was in the room with everybody, and it was Calvin's dad, and he was saying that there was an incident where Calvin was hurt, but I couldn't really tell how bad it was hurt. But Calvin was at our house just last night. He left from our house, so it seemed like such a fresh thing. We had a couple of friends from our old band that we were together, and we wanted to walk the tracks.
I was at my neighbor's telling him what had happened, and Justin called and said, "Hey, we found something, you need to come look at this." And I said, "Well, where are you?" And they said, "Well, we're right here on Team Track Road, just not even a quarter mile from Pete's." And I went, "Okay."
And that's the bar.
Yeah, and I said, "Okay, I'm on my way."
Calvin was hit and then dragged under the train for a distance as the train screeched to a halt, EMTs prying him out, grievously injured, and rushing him to the hospital.
What we found when we came out here was between the ties, these two ties, rail to rail, was a pool of blood. Totally bloodstained. Inside of these rails, on both sides, was blood streaked that direction, which is the direction the train was coming. Which indicates that he was laying here bleeding out when the train struck him. His shoe was approximately here. His pay stubs his lighter, more pay stubs, and after we looked further, we found blood right where the blue car is in the road with another one of his lighters, both identified by his best friend because he had just bought him a 5-pack of little mini lighters. There was one here, and there was one over by his blood over there, which the authorities said was due to that's where they put him in the ambulance. Why would they carry him from here all the way over there to put him in an ambulance when the ambulance could have parked right here? We also found drag marks in the gravel from point A to point B and blood drops on the gravel from there to here. So unless they drug him from here to there to put him in the ambulance, that wouldn't explain that. The blood could have dripped off the gurney. It could have dripped off when they put him in the ambulance, but why so far? They could have parked right here.
To keep from just collapsing from her grief and frustration, Toni Kelley works hard at several jobs. She and her family made numerous visits to the Auburn Police Department to show them the information they'd found. The cops seemed uninterested. Auburn Detective Carlos Castaner insisted, without substantive investigation, that her son had killed himself. Toni balked, knowing that for one thing, Calvin was a real wimp when it came to physical pain.
Scratch on the finger is a big deal. Laying down in front of a train, it's out of the question.
Calvin, as described by his sister, Ellen.
He was always just happy to be around. And when it came to things that were really bothering him, he would call me. He would talk to me. He would tell me.
And nothing like that?
Never, ever.
Was he in the habit of curling up in a ball and going to sleep in dangerous places?
Most certainly not.
Close family friend April Ostrom knew Calvin most of his life.
I don't think I've ever seen Calvin depressed. I don't think I've seen Calvin ever in a bad mood. I would have to describe Calvin as probably one of the iconic happy-go-lucky kids that there is. Very grounded, stable. He was very dedicated to his family, dedicated to his daughter, dedicated to his mother of his child. Calvin was working several different jobs in order to provide support for the child and the mother.
Did he resent that, do you think?
Oh gosh, no, he adored Eva. That was the light of his life.
Calvin's longtime girlfriend and mother of their daughter, Evangeline, Brittany Duran.
Let it go.
Let it go. Like this. Keep going.
I want you guys to see.
Okay, well, she doesn't really ask about him. She knows. I mean, in the past, she did ask, obviously, and we told her that Daddy Calvin had passed away and moved up to heaven, because that's her only life and death concept is when you move and pass on, you go up to heaven.
Right.
I've walked the tracks with Calvin many a times within the 5 years we were together, and there was never one time that we never made it home.
And everybody walks on those tracks, right?
Yes,
it's kind of a path.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of a, it's because it's easier to get around because a lot of the streets here don't have sidewalks.
Detectives never bothered to talk to Brittany in their investigation.
I've never talked to the Auburn Police Department. I haven't talked to anybody other than, of course, you guys. I mean, he was a human. He wasn't just some guy that got drunk and passed out on the train tracks, you know?
Friend April says detectives were cold with the family.
How disrespectful and degrading the detectives there had treated her, telling her basically, I'm sorry about your luck. Your son took a dirt nap on the tracks. He committed suicide. You're just going to have to deal with that.
Local florist Lisa McNabb, mother of Justin, Calvin's bandmate and best friend, was shocked that law enforcement was so laissez-faire about Calvin's suspicious death. She adored Calvin. He was like another son.
They just want to say he killed himself or it was an accident. And they didn't investigate from the get-go. I mean, my son had to go out to the tracks. They found where Calvin was hit. His shoe, his personal items were still on the tracks. They never collected anything for evidence. Immediately, that was our main question. Where is his cell phone? This kid always was with his cell phone. And the police department told me, we have his cell phone in evidence.
They told you they had it?
Yes. From the get-go, they had it.
No doubt about that. They told you early on
Yes.
that they had the cell phone.
From day one, they had the phone. Months down the road, when I hired the district attorney's office, or had them involved anyway, he called me up and he says, Lisa, I've been to APD. The phone has never been written into evidence. There is no phone. And that upset us because we wanted it pinged to find out where Calvin's location was, see who he was talking to, all of that. So we really thought that that was a big thing.
Detectives said they'd looked for videos from the businesses at the site, but Industrial Park property manager Bev Macy says that didn't happen. The day before, Macy talked face-to-face with police after an unrelated incident at her facility. She wanted to impress upon them that she was always available to assist them. She gave them her card, told them that her duty was to protect her tenants' interests. She was surprised when they didn't contact her about Calvin. Macy said, and I quote, "Well, I would think that because of the increased thefts, the increased transients, and how many people have already lost their lives on this track, that there would have been a proactive, approach to either preventing it or finding out what happened." Detectives from the Auburn Police Department stated in their records that they had spoken to Calvin's brother. Calvin had 2 sisters, but no brother. APD also claimed in writing that they had interviewed other witnesses. They said those witnesses were distinctly uncooperative, but instead of further investigation, the cops said they decided to close the case and leave any further work on it to Union Pacific. I talked to Union Pacific spokesman Justin Jacobs about how UP's law enforcement unit and local cops cooperate in investigations of train deaths.
But ultimately, law enforcement would be the final arbiter, say, of declaring it a suicide or foul play. It's sort of their jurisdiction ultimately.
Yes. The pesky issue of Calvin's cell phone is mind-boggling. First, detectives said they had the phone in evidence. Then the DA said they didn't. Then after over a year, detectives said the phone had been misplaced, but found again. They said they needed the family's approval to examine the phone. Since the owner was deceased and they had probable cause, this wasn't strictly true. Mike Kelley minced no words with Detective Carlos Castaner.
Again, is there a reason why we're doing this now, a year and a half later, and it wasn't done before?
Well, I was trying to explain to you before on the telephone that there was a piece of evidence that was misplaced and it was located.
The cell phone?
Yeah.
And where was it?
Not getting into everything right now, but
Well, it's misplaced, I mean, so...
It was in a vehicle and it was located. It's in our custody, it's evidence. So if something does turn out from it, we don't want to break the chain of custody. We're trying to keep the chain of custody.
The chain of custody was already broken when the phone disappeared for some period of time.
Okay.
I'd like to talk to my wife more than anything.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm guessing here, if I had to say, he probably will sign it. They probably both will.
Mike. I mean, I'm not gonna twist your arm if you feel more comfortable thinking about it, or
He wants to cooperate for obvious reasons.
I get you want to cooperate. I'm not gonna twist anybody's arm to do anything.
No,
we
already have the discussion.
No, if you want to.
You know why
I understand.
It's because of you guys not cooperating with us.
Okay.
Not contacting us when it happened, not wanting to talk to us at all, not wanting to go look at the evidence on the scene that we found, not going to the hospital and looking at his body when he was laying there fighting for his life. When all the physical evidence, was there, but nobody wanted to go look at it. because it wasn't your problem. And then when we go to Union Pacific, because you said it was their problem, and then they tried to contact you, nobody here would talk to them either. See, that's really where all this frustration and hesitation comes from, is from, you know, your lack of transparency. You know, I mean, I don't get it. Can you explain any of that to me? Why somebody didn't go down and look at him when he was in the hospital, when the wounds were fresh? When there was a visible heel mark on his chest? That didn't get caused by the train. While he was laying in his own blood, a puddle of blood that filled up between both tracks and two ties, enough blood where he was laying when the train hit him, enough blood to splatter it down the inside of both rails, the direction the train was traveling. That you guys didn't want to go look at that?
Kenton Wong, one of California's top senior forensic scientists and an expert in crime scene investigations, says there are basic standards for detectives when bodies are found.
Should they cordon off the area and protect it from any interlopers who might pick up a piece of evidence? And when they sort of cordon off the area first and keep people out of it? I mean, just generally.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And can you think of any situations where there would be an exception to that? It seems sort of basic to me that you would at least...
Not in my experience.
No.
No, I don't think there's ever been an exception.
Yeah. So
You just never know what type of forensic evidence may be left behind, whether it's a button from a shirt or a jacket, or a torn piece of material, or a footwear impression in dirt. There could be a number of different pieces of physical evidence that may be important and critical to that scene, and you want to cordon off that area and protect it, because like I said, you only have one chance to retrieve and recover it.
Kenton Wong was stunned to hear that Placer Sheriff's deputies were already waiting at the hospital to remove Calvin's body the instant he died, against his parents' wishes.
Have you ever heard of anything like that?
And they didn't sign a release on the body.
Did not sign a release on the body.
That's highly irregular.
That would not be common practice to your knowledge.
I don't believe so, no.
Calvin's sister Ellen sums it up.
And I look at this town and I think what it's been built up to be. This has been built up to be kind of like a little second heaven. This is the gateway to the Sierras. This is where everybody from the Bay Area is moving to. Housing prices are going up. I think that it would put a nasty scar on this community that has been considered to be such high class, high end, the place you want to go to. Why would you dare compromise that? That's one idea I had, and the other one is just, again, this is a small town. Things don't happen like this in small towns. And think of the effort that it would take to pursue something like this on behalf of the local police department.
I mean, to act like a police department is expected to
do everything that's needed to be done, that should have been done during this whole thing, would have probably taken a heck of a lot more than it would have taken to write a traffic ticket or to bust somebody for, drunk driving or skateboarding. It's Auburn. You don't deal with those sorts of things. And I think that they just weren't willing to put in the effort that was needed.
We're here at the Placer County Courthouse in Auburn. It's probably one of the prettiest courthouses in the entire state of California. It's also the symbol of justice for this entire region. We examined 10 suspicious deaths in this documentary, 6 of them in the canals, 4 on the train tracks. There were many other cases similarly situated that we didn't look at. And there were shortcuts. Much like the shortcuts that the canals and the tracks provide for the people of Auburn, law enforcement took some very quick shortcuts in almost instantly determining that none of these deaths were suspicious. Even a seasoned, very, very calm and deliberative reporter, Gus Thompson at the Auburn Journal, disagrees. He says there are plenty of reasons to ask questions.
It's a cumulative effect. the more people come into the picture and leave the picture, the more you're thinking, well, is this a serial killer? Obviously.
Was the rush to judgment rather like Calvin Kelley's sister Ellen suggested, that the cops just didn't want to put in the effort? Or, as civil rights litigator Mark Marin puts it, Auburn is not unique in applying a so-called sliding scale of justice depending on the economic status of victims. In your experience, just your personal intuitive experience, and as a lawyer who's done so much to try to find solutions for the homeless people and people of low income in this community, do you think that law enforcement has a different standard in terms of how they investigate crimes against those people?
Oh, I do. I think that generally they allocate their resources based on the people that feel they have to be responsive to. And those are usually the well-off, the better off, the ones who can call and say, hey, how about doing this or that? People who are homeless, as you say, low-income status, poor people, who's the advocate for them? When their bodies show up on the bike trail or someone, it's usually just imputed to their own lifestyle. It's very hard actually to find out what the police are doing, because when someone dies and you want to get a police report, it's like pulling teeth to get it.
That's been our experience too. Do you ever hear of any specific cases where a homeless person that you heard about had been assaulted or killed, say along the river here in Sacramento, and there were witnesses and the cops didn't do anything or did do something?
Well, I gave you an example earlier of this one guy. His name was Cricket or Griffin. I'm not exactly. His first name was Michael. I know that. He was known as the Cat Man because he took care of some of the feral cats out there, and they responded. You know, cats seem to know who likes them and who doesn't. And he interceded in a battle that was going on, an assault to try to come to the rescue of somebody, and he was killed. And as far as I know, nobody was ever even interviewed other than maybe the people who went to the police and said, hey, I saw this. And nobody was ever taken into custody or charged with that. The police prioritize matters, and the homeless man or woman on the street isn't very high on the list when it comes to trying to investigate to get to the bottom of a crime.
We tried telephonically and electronically multiple times asking the Placer County Sheriff's Department and the Auburn Police Department for interviews about these cases. Documentary staffer Ryan Olison.
We did reach out to the Placer County Sheriff's Department and the Auburn Police Department. We went in, we called, and we sent emails. The only thing that they were really responsive on was the emails. Hey Ryan, I believe some of the topics you're referring to are still being investigated, so unfortunately the police department will not be able to participate. Then from the Placer County Sheriff's Department, the response that we received says, Ryan, after some discussion on our end, it's been decided that we're not going to comment on or discuss the cases. Thanks for checking back. The second that we would mention the canal or the tracks, they would be suddenly taken aback. They would not respond for a few days. They would act sort of nervous. So I think even they know that there's a lot surrounding these different cases. I think that the families deserve answers on these cases, and I really hope that they'll find some of the answers.
Perhaps because both agencies were under intense scrutiny at the time, they didn't have time for our request. For example, the Placer County Sheriff's Department had 3 of its deputies prosecuted for beating the bejesus out of inmates. The Auburn PD cringed when one of its own, a former Auburn Police Department officer, was charged, arrested for multiple rapes and murders, the prime suspect in the notorious Golden State Killer case. Then there was a woman whose body was found literally a stone's throw from the Auburn Police Department in the bushes. She had pounded on their door late at night for help. The Auburn Police Department said it was a suicide. I asked her sister, Deborah, how she had died.
They told me that her panties were in her throat.
panties were in her throat.
Private investigators DeMace and Goodrich would like to see changes.
So there's something awry, there's something wrong, there's something amiss.
What I'd like to see happen from this documentary and the investigation that Jim Goodrich and I have done is to have an outside agency come in, preferably from the Department of Justice, whatever their investigation arm might be. I don't know if it would be the FBI or an associate department or whatever. Because what's happened here is we've seen a trend going back to, probably the 90s of non-investigation.
All of these victims were somebody's someone. The family members and friends that we talked to were glad that someone cared enough to even ask. They hope this documentary will bring forth clues, tips, and truth. The ones who have met each other have found solace and comfort in the shared common experience. And several of them really believe, and it's a good bet, that someone out there knows what really went down. The question is, will that person or persons have the courage to come forward?
Hughes Audio and Video Entertainment. When you want the best, have the best.